Stepmother forced her stepdaughter to marry a beggar. The wedding day revelation shocked everyone. The sun was relentless, beating down mercilessly on the sidewalks of New York City. Among the bustling crowds and towering skyscrapers sat Marcus, a young man of 28, whose weary eyes reflected a life far older than his years. His unkempt hair fell into his face, partially hiding the hollowness in his cheeks. He wore a threadbare hoodie that hung loosely on his once strong frame, and his sneakers were so worn they barely held together. The streets had a way of stripping a person of everything but the bare essentials, and even those were scarce. Marcus sat slumped against the side of a building on Fifth Avenue, watching the tide of people flow by. It was as if he were invisible, a shadow in a city that never paused to notice its own. His stomach growled loudly, but he was too drained to even feel embarrassed. Hunger had become his constant companion, a gnawing ache that robbed him of sleep and peace. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill. It wasn't enough for a hot meal, not in this part of the city. He thought about heading to the nearest shelter, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. His last visit to a shelter had ended in a scuffle over a blanket, and he wasn't eager to repeat the experience. Marcus let out a long sigh, running a hand through his matted hair. "Just one more day," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the hum of the city. "One more day and maybe someone will notice. Maybe something will change." But even as he said the words, he felt the weight of hopelessness pressing on him. For hours Marcus sat there, his gaze following people as they passed. Businessmen in tailored suits, women in designer dresses, tourists snapping photos of the towering buildings. They all walked quickly, purposefully, their lives seemingly worlds apart from his. He envied their confidence, their ease, and most of all their ability to ignore him. Every now and then someone would glance in his direction, their eyes flickering with pity or discomfort before they hurried on their way. Marcus hated those looks even more than he hated being ignored. He didn't want pity. He wanted a chance, a job, a place to sleep, a meal that wasn't scavenged from a trash bin. The smells of the city were overwhelming. The rich aroma of roasted coffee from a nearby cafe, the savory scent of hot dogs sizzling on a cart just across the street. Marcus's stomach twisted painfully. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, and his body was starting to feel the strain. The temptation to cross the street and beg for a hot dog was strong, but his pride held him back. "Come on, Marcus," he muttered under his breath. "You're better than this." An older man sitting a few feet away chuckled softly. "Better than what, kid? We're all just trying to survive out here." Marcus glanced at him. The man had a scruffy gray beard and wore several layers of mismatched clothing. His eyes, though tired, held a spark of humor. Marcus managed a weak smile. "Yeah, I guess you're right." The man leaned back against the wall, his voice gruff but kind. "Life on the streets isn't easy, but you learn to make do. People aren't as heartless as they seem. Someone will help you eventually." Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He had seen the worst of humanity during his time on the streets, fights over scraps of food, theft, cruelty. But he had also seen rare moments of kindness, like the time a stranger handed him a warm coffee on a freezing winter night. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus's hope began to wane. The ache in his stomach was becoming unbearable, and the thought of rummaging through a trash can for leftovers was becoming harder to resist. He clenched his fists, determined to hold on to the last shred of his dignity. Suddenly, a shadow fell over him. Marcus looked up to see a middle-aged woman standing in front of him, holding a paper bag. She was dressed in business attire, her hair neatly styled, and her expression was one of quiet compassion. Without a word, she handed him the bag and walked away. Marcus stared after her, stunned. He opened the bag and the scent of freshly baked bread and roasted meat filled his senses. It was a sandwich, still warm. His hands trembled as he held the bag, the simple act of kindness bringing tears to his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, even though the woman was already gone. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still kindness left in the world. Marcus took a deep breath and prepared to eat the sandwich, but then he noticed 2 other homeless men sitting nearby, their faces just as gaunt and hollow as his own. He hesitated, glancing between the sandwich and the men. Without a second thought, he stood up and walked over to them. "Here," he said, breaking the sandwich into 3 pieces and handing them each a portion. "We can share. No one should go hungry." The older man from earlier smiled at Marcus. "You've got a good heart, kid. Don't lose that." The streets of New York bustled with their usual chaotic rhythm, a blend of hurried footsteps, blaring car horns, and the constant hum of conversations. Among the crowd was Emily, a young woman in her early 20s with a heart as warm as the soft autumn sun. Her long brown hair shimmered under the light, and her emerald green eyes scanned the surroundings with a mix of curiosity and concern. She walked beside her stepmother, Victoria, whose sharp features and tailored designer coat matched her cold and commanding demeanor. Emily struggled to keep up with Victoria's brisk pace as they navigated Fifth Avenue. Victoria's heels clacked against the pavement like a metronome, her phone glued to her hand as she typed furiously. Emily sighed, her gaze drifting to the world beyond the glimmering shop windows. "Keep up, Emily," Victoria snapped without looking up. "We have an appointment, and I won't have you embarrassing me by being late." "Yes, Victoria," Emily replied, her tone subdued. She had grown used to her stepmother's sharp tongue, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. As they walked, Emily's attention was drawn to a figure slumped against the side of a building. It was Marcus, sitting in the same spot where he had spent most of his day. His head was bowed, his disheveled hair partially hiding his gaunt face. His worn clothes clung loosely to his thin frame, and he clutched a crumpled paper bag in one hand. Though he had eaten only a small piece of the sandwich given to him earlier, he had shared the rest with 2 other homeless men. The gratitude in their eyes had been enough to fill his empty stomach, at least emotionally. Emily slowed her pace, her heart aching at the sight of Marcus. She could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the hollow look in his eyes that spoke of a life far harder than she could imagine. Despite his circumstances, there was a quiet dignity about him that caught her attention. "Victoria," Emily said hesitantly, gesturing toward Marcus. "Look at him. We should help." Victoria stopped abruptly, turning to face Emily with a withering glare. "Help?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Emily, I've warned you about this. These people are not our responsibility." "But he looks like he hasn't eaten in days," Emily insisted, her voice trembling with emotion. "We can't just walk past him." Victoria's lips thinned into a tight line. "Emily, you have no idea what you're talking about. These people are where they are because of their own choices. Giving them money or food won't change anything. They'll just squander it." "You don't know that," Emily shot back, surprising herself with her boldness. "What if he just needs a little kindness to turn his life around?" Victoria's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on Emily's arm. "Kindness?" she hissed. "The world is not kind, Emily. It's cruel. And the sooner you understand that, the better." Emily pulled her arm free, her green eyes blazing with determination. "Then maybe it's up to us to change that," she said firmly. Without waiting for Victoria's response, Emily crossed the street and approached Marcus. Her steps were hesitant at first, but as she drew closer, she felt a surge of courage. She reached into her purse and pulled out a handful of bills, her heart pounding as she knelt in front of him. "Hi," she said softly, holding out the money. "I hope this can help, even just a little." Marcus looked up, startled by the sudden kindness. His blue eyes met hers, and for a moment the noise of the city seemed to fade away. He hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation, before finally accepting the money. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse but sincere. "You didn't have to do this." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and sadness. "Everyone deserves a little help sometimes," she replied. "I just hope things get better for you." Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "You've already made today better. Thank you." Before Emily could say more, Victoria appeared behind her, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "Emily, enough of this nonsense," she snapped, grabbing her stepdaughter's arm and pulling her to her feet. "We're leaving. Now." "Wait," Emily protested, glancing back at Marcus. "No." Victoria interrupted, her tone icy. "You've embarrassed me enough for one day." Marcus watched them go, his gratitude for Emily's kindness overshadowed by the sting of Victoria's words. As they disappeared into the crowd, he clutched the money tightly in his hand, a small spark of hope flickering in his chest. Back on the sidewalk, Emily struggled to keep up with Victoria's furious pace. "Why do you care so much about what people think?" she asked, her voice trembling with frustration. "Helping someone isn't embarrassing. It's the right thing to do." Victoria stopped abruptly, turning to face Emily with a cold smile. "You're so naive, Emily," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "One day you'll understand that kindness is a weakness, and when that day comes, you'll thank me for teaching you how the world really works." Emily said nothing, her mind replaying the brief moment she had shared with Marcus. Despite her stepmother's harsh words, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had done the right thing. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that kindness wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. As they continued down the street, Emily cast one last glance over her shoulder. Marcus was still sitting there, his gaze fixed on the money in his hand. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and Emily offered him a small, encouraging smile. Marcus nodded in return, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. In that brief exchange, an unspoken connection passed between them. A connection that neither of them could fully understand, but would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Victoria's heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor of the mansion as she stormed into the grand entryway. Emily trailed behind her, her steps slower, her heart heavy with the memory of the young man she had helped on the street. The harsh look on Victoria's face told Emily that she was in for yet another lecture about her so-called misguided compassion. "Sit," Victoria ordered, pointing to a chair in the lavishly decorated sitting room. Emily hesitated but obeyed, knowing resistance would only make things worse. Victoria stood before her, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of frustration and something colder: calculation. "You embarrassed me today, Emily," Victoria began, her tone sharp. "Do you have any idea what people might think? A girl of your status mingling with street beggars? It's disgraceful." Emily's green eyes flared with defiance. "It's not disgraceful to show kindness to someone in need," she said firmly. "That man, he was starving. How could I just walk past him?" Victoria's lips curled into a cold smile. "How indeed? You've always had a bleeding heart, Emily, but let me remind you, we have a reputation to uphold. Our family is respected. Actions like yours tarnish that respect." Emily's hands clenched into fists on her lap. "Reputation? Respect? Is that all you care about? People are suffering, Victoria, and all you care about is how it looks?" Victoria's eyes narrowed, and for a moment there was a flicker of something darker in her expression. "You'll understand one day, Emily, that the world doesn't reward kindness. It rewards power, control, and appearances." Emily stood abruptly, her frustration boiling over. "You're wrong. The world needs kindness. It needs people who care. I refuse to believe that helping someone is ever the wrong thing to do." Victoria's sharp laugh echoed through the room. "Then perhaps you need to learn that lesson the hard way, my dear." "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. The look in Victoria's eyes sent a chill down her spine. Victoria began pacing, her heels clicking against the floor as her mind worked. "You're so eager to help those beneath you, so determined to defy me. Fine. Let's see how far your kindness goes when it costs you everything." Emily frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Victoria stopped pacing and turned to face Emily, her cold smile returning. "You'll marry that beggar." Emily's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What? No, you can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," Victoria replied, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. "You seem to think he's worthy of your kindness. Let's see if you're willing to commit to it. After all, marriage is the ultimate act of compassion, isn't it?" "This is insane," Emily exclaimed, her voice rising. "You can't force me to marry someone." Victoria arched an eyebrow. "Can't I? Your father will agree. He's as concerned about our reputation as I am. And don't think for a moment that I won't find a way to make this happen, Emily." Emily's chest tightened as panic set in. "Why are you doing this? What do you gain from humiliating me like this?" Victoria's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. "What I gain, Emily, is control. You've been defying me for too long, making decisions that jeopardize this family's standing. This marriage will serve as a reminder that actions have consequences." Emily stared at her stepmother, her heart pounding. "You're punishing me. For what? For caring? For wanting to make a difference?" Victoria stepped closer, her voice low and menacing. "You think your compassion is noble, but it's weakness, Emily. And weakness has no place in this family." Later that evening, Victoria sat alone in her study, a glass of wine in hand and a self-satisfied smirk on her lips. She was already formulating her plan. She would approach the beggar, Marcus, with an offer he couldn't refuse, a life of comfort and luxury in exchange for his cooperation. The next morning, Victoria donned her most elegant coat and strode confidently down Fifth Avenue, scanning the street for the man Emily had so foolishly helped. It didn't take long to find him. Marcus was sitting in the same spot, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. Victoria stopped in front of him, her shadow falling over his thin frame. Marcus looked up, startled, his blue eyes wary. He recognized her immediately as the woman who had pulled Emily away the day before. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Victoria's smile was sharp and cold. "You're the man my stepdaughter helped yesterday," she said, her tone smooth but condescending. "I have a proposal for you." Marcus frowned, confused. "A proposal?" "Yes," Victoria replied, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. "How would you like to change your life? No more hunger, no more cold nights on the street. I can give you a home, food, clothes, everything you could ever want." Marcus's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why? What's the catch?" Victoria's smile widened. "You'll marry my stepdaughter." Marcus's breath hitched and he stared at her in disbelief. "What?" "You heard me," Victoria said, her tone casual as if she were discussing a simple business transaction. "In exchange for a life of comfort, you'll marry Emily. Of course, I'll provide you with a generous sum of money as well." Marcus shook his head, his heart pounding. "I can't do that. I won't use someone like that." Victoria's expression darkened, but she quickly regained her composure. "Think about it, Marcus. With the money I'm offering, you could help people like yourself. Isn't that what you want?" Marcus hesitated, her words planting a seed of doubt in his mind. The thought of being able to help others was tempting, but the idea of being part of Victoria's scheme made his stomach turn. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice filled with suspicion. Victoria's smile returned, colder than ever. "Let's just say it's a lesson Emily needs to learn." Marcus clenched his fists, torn between his principles and the opportunity to make a difference. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely audible. "Fine, I'll do it." Victoria straightened, her smile triumphant. "Good choice. Don't worry, you'll thank me one day." As Victoria walked away, Marcus remained seated, staring at the ground. He felt a knot of guilt forming in his chest, but he reminded himself of the good he could do with the money. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," he whispered. The cold night air settled over the city as Marcus returned to his familiar corner, the weight of Victoria's proposal pressing heavily on his chest. His usual refuge, the quiet solitude of the streets, offered no comfort. Instead, his mind churned with the impossible choice he had just made. He sat on the cracked pavement, staring at the bills Victoria had handed him as a down payment. The crisp, clean paper felt foreign in his calloused hands, a stark contrast to the reality he lived every day. Marcus's heart raced as he tried to convince himself that this arrangement could be for the greater good. "You'll marry my stepdaughter," Victoria's cold voice echoed in his mind, and the knot in his stomach tightened. Marcus clenched his fists, the bills crumpling slightly in his grip. "Am I really about to trade my dignity for this?" he murmured, his voice barely audible above the hum of the city. As the hours stretched on, Marcus's thoughts drifted to the life he had lost. He barely remembered it now. Flashes of warm sunlight through large windows, a gentle voice humming a lullaby, and the faint scent of lavender that clung to his mother's embrace. Those memories, though hazy, were the only fragments of comfort he had carried with him through the years. But there were darker memories, too. Whispers behind closed doors. A cold, calculating voice, Victoria's, speaking words that a child couldn't fully understand but felt deeply. He remembered being taken away, though the details were blurred like a dream slipping through his fingers. "Why can't I remember?" Marcus muttered, his head in his hands. A rustling sound pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see an elderly man standing nearby, leaning heavily on a worn cane. The man's sharp eyes studied him intently, and there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. "Young man," the stranger said, his voice trembling with age but steady with purpose. "Forgive me for staring, but you look familiar." Makis blinked, confused. "I think you've got the wrong guy," he replied, brushing off the comment. The man took a cautious step closer, his gaze fixed on Makis's face. "No, I don't think I do. That mark on your wrist? Where did you get it?" Makis instinctively glanced at the small birthmark on his wrist, shaped like a crescent moon. "I've always had it," he said, his tone wary. "Why?" The man's hand tightened on his cane, his knuckles turning white. "I knew someone who had that same mark," he said slowly. "Jonathan Howard. Do you know that name?" Makis shook his head. "No. Should I?" The man hesitated, then leaned in, lowering his voice. "Jonathan Howard was one of the wealthiest men in this city. A good man, but he passed away under mysterious circumstances years ago. He had a son, Hudson, a boy who disappeared when he was very young, and you look just like him." Makis froze, his mind racing. Hudson Howard. The name felt distant yet oddly familiar, like a word on the tip of his tongue. "You think I'm that boy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think, son. I know," the man said firmly. "I was an old friend of your father's. I was there when you were born. That birthmark, it's unmistakable." Makis's breath caught, his pulse thundering in his ears. "That can't be true. I'm nobody." The man shook his head. "You're not nobody, Makis, or Hudson, if that's your name. Someone took you away from your life, from your family, and I have a feeling that someone was Victoria." The name struck Makis like a blow, and his hands trembled. Victoria. Her cold eyes, her disdain for him, her eagerness to use him in her schemes. Could it all be connected? Makis spent the night wrestling with the revelation. If what the old man said was true, then he wasn't just a beggar on the streets. He was someone with a past, a family, a name. But the thought filled him with as much dread as it did hope. If he confronted Victoria with this knowledge, what would she do? And what about Emily? Emily. Her kind eyes and gentle smile haunted him. She had been the first person in years to treat him like he mattered. How could he go through with this sham of a marriage, knowing the truth? How could he use her kindness against her? And yet the money Victoria had promised him could change everything. It could help the friends he had made on the streets, the people who had shared their meager scraps with him when he had nothing. "Am I willing to sacrifice my integrity to help others?" Makis muttered to himself, his voice trembling. "Is it worth it?" By the time the sun rose, Makis had made his choice. He wasn't sure if it was the right one, but it was the only path that made sense to him in the moment. He would go through with Victoria's plan, but not for her reasons. He would do it to uncover the truth, to protect Emily, and to find out if he really was Hudson Howard. "I'll play her game," Makis murmured, his jaw tightening with resolve. "But only until I can expose the truth." With that, Makis rose from the pavement, his eyes no longer dull with despair but blazing with determination. He had spent years feeling lost and powerless, but now, for the first time, he felt like he had a purpose. And he would see it through, no matter what it cost him. The morning of the wedding arrived with a flurry of activity. The grand Howard estate, adorned with flowers and gilded decorations, stood as a beacon of luxury and spectacle. Yet beneath the surface of this elaborate display, tension simmered like an unspoken storm. Makis sat in a small guest room, his reflection staring back at him from an ornate mirror. The tailored suit he wore was a perfect fit, a far cry from the tattered clothes he had lived in just days ago. Yet he felt like an imposter. The weight of the day, Victoria's manipulations, and the secrets he now carried pressed down on his chest. He ran a hand through his neatly combed hair, his jaw tightening as he thought about Emily. She didn't deserve this. None of it. He knew she was just as much a pawn in Victoria's scheme as he was. But this wedding, this charade, was also his chance to reveal the truth, to expose Victoria for who she truly was. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. The butler entered, his expression as impassive as ever. "It's time, sir," he said. Makis took a deep breath and rose to his feet. "Let's get this over with," he murmured. In her bridal suite, Emily sat stiffly as a team of stylists fussed over her hair and makeup. Her white dress, with its intricate lace and shimmering pearls, made her look like a princess, but her heart felt heavy with dread. The woman staring back at her from the mirror seemed like a stranger, a bride preparing for a future she hadn't chosen. "Isn't it lovely, dear?" Victoria's voice cut through the room like a blade. She stood in the doorway, her expression one of smug satisfaction. "You'll be the talk of the town." Emily turned to her stepmother, her green eyes flashing with defiance. "What you're doing is cruel, Victoria. This isn't a wedding. It's a public humiliation." Victoria's lips curled into a cold smile. "Oh, Emily, don't be so dramatic. This is what happens when you defy me. Consider it a lesson." Emily's fists clenched in her lap, but she forced herself to remain composed. "You can force me to go through with this, but you can't control how I feel. I won't let you break me." Victoria's smile faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "We'll see, my dear. We'll see." The grand hall of the estate was filled with New York's elite, their whispers and murmurs creating a low hum of gossip. Victoria had ensured that everyone knew about Emily's disgraceful marriage to a man from the streets. She wanted this to be a spectacle, a moment Emily would never forget, or forgive. Makis stood at the altar, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. The opulence of the room felt suffocating, a sharp contrast to the streets he had called home. He could feel the judgmental eyes of the guests boring into him, their whispers stinging like needles. "Is that him? The beggar?" one woman whispered to her companion. "He cleaned up well, but you can't hide where he came from," the other replied with a sneer. Makis's jaw tightened. "Let them talk," he thought. "Soon, none of this will matter." The music began to play and the room fell silent. All eyes turned to the grand staircase as Emily appeared at the top, her hand resting lightly on her father's arm. She looked stunning, her dress catching the light like a cascade of stars. But her face was pale, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. As she descended the staircase, Emily's gaze met Makis's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. In his eyes, she saw something unexpected, an unspoken promise, a silent assurance that she wasn't alone in this. When Emily reached the altar, she turned to face Makis. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this? Why did you agree to this?" Makis hesitated, his throat tightening. "Because there's more to this than you know. Trust me, Emily. Just trust me." Her eyes searched his, and though she didn't fully understand, she gave a small nod. They turned to face the Reverend, who began the ceremony. The words blurred together in Makis's mind as he waited for the crucial moment. His heart pounded as the Reverend finally spoke the words that would give him the chance he needed. "If anyone has any reason why this marriage should not take place, speak now or forever. Hold your peace." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of anticipation pressing down on everyone. Makis's breath hitched, but before he could speak, a voice rang out. "I have something to say." All heads turned as Victoria stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She stood before the crowd, her expression one of triumphant cruelty. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "before this union is finalized, I think it's only fair that you all know the truth about this man." Makis's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Victoria turned to the crowd, her arms spread wide in a theatrical gesture. "This man, standing at the altar with my stepdaughter, is not who he claims to be. He is nothing more than a beggar, a man who lived on the streets until just days ago." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Makis remained composed. He took a step forward, his voice steady and strong. "You're right, Victoria. I did live on the streets. But there's something you've failed to mention." Victoria froze, her smile faltering. "What are you talking about?" Makis turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying with newfound confidence. "My name isn't just Makis. I'm Hudson Howard, the son of Jonathan Howard." A collective gasp echoed through the room as Makis revealed the truth. Years ago, I was taken from my family. I was abandoned and left to survive on the streets, and the person responsible for that is standing right here." He turned to Victoria, his gaze piercing. "Victoria orchestrated my disappearance to seize control of my father's wealth." The room erupted into chaos as guests whispered and shouted, their shock and outrage filling the air. Victoria's face turned pale, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of the truth. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "Is this true, Victoria? Did you do this?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The evidence was damning, and she knew it. Robert, Emily's father, stood and placed a hand on Makis's shoulder. "If what you're saying is true, then justice will be served. Victoria, you will answer for this." Makis turned to Emily, his eyes softening. "I never wanted to hurt you, Emily, but you deserve to know the truth." Emily nodded, her tears falling freely. "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for trusting me." The grand hall of the Howard estate descended into chaos following Makis's shocking revelation. Guests whispered furiously among themselves, their murmurs filling the air like a rising tide. Emily stood frozen beside Makis, her hands trembling as the weight of his words sunk in. Victoria, pale and visibly shaken, took a hesitant step back. The icy confidence she had always wielded like a weapon faltered, and for the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. "This is absurd," she spat, though her voice lacked its usual venom. "You have no proof of these ridiculous claims." Makis took a steadying breath, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're right, Victoria. I don't have the proof here. But it exists." He turned to the crowd, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "An elderly man recognized me just days ago. He identified me by the birthmark on my wrist. Something that matches Jonathan Howard's son, Hudson, who mysteriously disappeared years ago." Gasps rippled through the room. All eyes turned to Victoria, who stood as still as a statue, her face now ghostly white. "You can't believe this man!" Victoria's voice rose in desperation, her carefully constructed facade crumbling with every passing second. "He's nothing but a street rat trying to con his way into wealth and status. He has no evidence." Makis stepped forward, his voice sharp. "You're the one with no evidence, Victoria. All I have are the scattered memories of my childhood, and even those are enough to expose you for the liar you are." He held up his wrist, revealing the crescent-shaped birthmark. "This was the first clue, and with DNA tests, I'll prove without a shadow of a doubt that I'm Jonathan Howard's son. Your lies are unraveling." The room erupted again, this time with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Several prominent guests glared at Victoria, their faces hardening with realization. Among them, Makis spotted Robert, Emily's father, standing silently near the front. His face was pale, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "Victoria, is it true? Did you do this? Did you abandon a child to take his inheritance?" Victoria's lips trembled, and for a moment, it looked as though she might deny it. But the pressure of the crowd and the weight of the truth were too much. Her shoulders sagged, and she let out a bitter laugh. "You naive little fool," she hissed, her voice laced with bitterness. "Yes, I did it. What of it? Hudson was just a child standing in the way of everything I deserved. I wasn't going to let some infant take away my chance at the life I worked so hard for." The crowd recoiled in shock at her confession. Even Robert, who had long been under her manipulative influence, took a step back, his face etched with a mix of disbelief and anger. "How could you?" Emily whispered, her voice cracking. "How could you do something so cruel, so heartless? He was just a child." Victoria's mask of calm finally shattered. "Because this world isn't kind, Emily," she shouted, her voice raw with emotion. "I did what I had to do to survive, to thrive, and I won't apologize for that." Makis stepped forward, his voice ringing with quiet intensity. "You can try to justify your actions all you want, Victoria, but the truth is, you ruined lives. My father trusted you. You betrayed him, and you stole my life, my chance at a family, at a future." He turned to the guests, his gaze sweeping the room. "This woman has lied to all of you. She manipulated her way into wealth and power. But now, The truth is out, and I won't let her get away with it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several guests began pulling out their phones, likely recording the scene or contacting the authorities. Victoria's confidence wavered further, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. Robert, who had been silent for most of the confrontation, finally spoke. His voice was heavy with regret. "Victoria, I've defended you for years. I trusted you. But I can't, no, I won't, stand by you after this." He turned to Makis, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I don't know if I can ever make up for what you've been through, but if you're truly my wife's son, you'll have my support. We'll do whatever it takes to help you reclaim your rightful place." Makis nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you. That's all I've ever wanted." Before Victoria could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air. 2 police officers entered the hall, their presence silencing the murmurs of the crowd. One of them stepped forward, addressing Victoria. "Mrs. Victoria Howard, we have a warrant for your arrest. You are charged with fraud, manipulation, and suspected involvement in the disappearance of Hudson Howard." Victoria's face twisted into a mask of rage and defiance. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked as the officer stepped forward to place her in handcuffs. "I built this life. You can't take it away from me." But her protests fell on deaf ears as the officers led her away. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, their judgmental stares cutting into her like knives. Victoria's reign was over. As the chaos began to settle, Emily turned to Makis. Her green eyes shone with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "You didn't have to do this for me." Makis shook his head, his expression softening. "It wasn't just for you. It was for me, for my father, and for everyone she hurt. But I couldn't have done it without you. Your kindness gave me the strength to face her." Emily smiled faintly, a hint of hope glimmering in her eyes. "Maybe now we can both start over. Together." Makis nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and determination. Together. The aftermath of Victoria's arrest was a whirlwind of emotions and activity. The Howard estate, once a symbol of wealth and opulence, became a focal point for media attention as reporters swarmed the gates, eager to cover the dramatic downfall of one of New York's most influential socialites. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter, but no less charged with emotion. The legal proceedings against Victoria moved quickly. The evidence of her fraud and manipulation was overwhelming, and her own confession at the wedding only solidified the case. Further investigation revealed documents in her private office that detailed her years of deceit, including the falsification of Makis's death and her orchestration of his disappearance. The prosecution wasted no time in building a case against her. Victoria, once the epitome of control and arrogance, now faced the harsh reality of her actions. Her trial became a public spectacle, with every sordid detail splashed across the headlines. She maintained her defiance in court, claiming that her actions were justified, but her cold demeanor only alienated her further. When the verdict was delivered, guilty on all charges, Victoria's empire crumbled. Her assets were seized, her reputation destroyed, and she was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. For the first time in her life, she was powerless, forced to face the consequences of her greed and cruelty. For Makis, the days following Victoria's downfall were surreal. The DNA results confirmed what he had already known in his heart. He was Hudson Howard, the long-lost heir to the Howard fortune. His name was restored, and with it came a life he had never imagined, a life filled with opportunity and responsibility. Returning to the Howard estate as its rightful owner was a bittersweet experience for Makis. As he walked through the grand halls, memories of his early childhood flickered in his mind. His father's warm smile, the sound of his laughter echoing through the house. But those memories were now tinged with sorrow for the years that had been stolen from him. Robert, deeply regretful for his role in enabling Victoria's schemes, approached Makis with humility. "I should have seen through her lies," he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "I failed you and Emily. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Makis placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "I've spent so much of my life holding on to anger, but it's time to let go. What matters now is what we do moving forward." As the dust settled, Makis and Emily grew closer. Their shared ordeal had forged an unbreakable bond, built on trust and understanding. Emily admired Makis's resilience and his determination to turn his pain into purpose, while Makis was inspired by Emily's compassion and strength. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the estate's gardens, Emily spoke softly. "Makis, what do you want to do now? With your life? With everything?" Makis looked out at the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "I want to make a difference. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to struggle just to survive. I want to use what I've been given to help others." Emily's eyes lit up. "I've been thinking the same thing. We have the resources and the influence to create real change. Maybe we can do it together." Makis turned to her, a smile spreading across his face. Together sounds perfect. Inspired by their shared vision, Makis and Emily founded the Howard Harrison Foundation, named in honor of their respective families. The foundation's mission was clear: to provide shelter, education, and opportunities for the homeless and underprivileged, turning compassion into tangible action. Their first project was a shelter for homeless individuals and families, built in the very neighborhood where Makis had once lived on the streets. The shelter offered not only a safe place to stay, but also job training programs, mental health support, and educational opportunities. During the shelter's opening ceremony, Makis gave a heartfelt speech. "This isn't just about me or Emily, it's about all of us. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person, no matter their circumstances. Kindness saved me, and now it's my turn to pass that kindness on." The audience erupted into applause, and Makis felt a deep sense of fulfillment. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at home. Not because of the wealth or the mansion, but because he was living with purpose. Robert, determined to make amends for his past mistakes, became actively involved in the foundation. He used his connections to secure funding and partnerships, ensuring the foundation's success. Working alongside Makis and Emily, he began to rebuild his relationship with both of them, proving that it was never too late to change. One afternoon, as they worked together on a new project, Robert turned to Makis. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "You've turned tragedy into something beautiful. Your father would be proud too." Makis nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you, Robert. That means more than you know." As the foundation grew, so did its impact. More shelters were opened across the city, and new programs were introduced to address issues like mental health, addiction, and education. Makis and Emily worked tirelessly, their passion inspiring others to join their cause. Makis often visited the shelters, sitting down to share meals and stories with the residents. He never forgot where he came from, and his humility endeared him to everyone he met. Emily, meanwhile, used her social connections to advocate for policy changes and rally support for their initiatives. Months after the chaos of their first wedding attempt, Makis and Emily decided to marry again, this time on their own terms. The ceremony was simple and intimate, held at one of their shelters, surrounded by the people whose lives they had touched. As they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Makis took Emily's hands in his voice steady with emotion. "You showed me kindness when I had nothing. You gave me hope when I'd lost it. I promise to spend the rest of my life sharing that kindness with the world, by your side." Emily smiled through her tears. "And I promise to always stand with you no matter what. Together, we'll keep building a world where kindness prevails." As they danced under the twinkling lights that evening, Makis and Emily felt a profound sense of peace. Their journey had been fraught with pain and hardship, but it had also brought them to this moment, a moment filled with love, purpose, and the promise of a brighter future. Their foundation became a symbol of hope, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, kindness and resilience could pave the way for redemption. Makis and Emily's story was a testament to the power of love, courage, and the human spirit's ability to rise above adversity. The sun rose over the bustling streets of New York, its warm light casting a golden glow on the city's newest beacon of hope, the Howard Harrison Community Center. Located just blocks away from the spot where Makis had once sat, cold and hungry, the center stood as a testament to the transformative power of kindness and resilience. Inside, the hum of activity was constant. Volunteers bustled about, preparing meals, arranging supplies, and welcoming visitors. The center offered more than shelter. It provided job training, educational workshops, mental health counseling, and a safe space for those seeking a second chance. Marcus stood in the center's lobby, dressed casually in a crisp white shirt and jeans, greeting guests with his usual warm smile. Beside him, Emily was busy coordinating with a group of volunteers. She had a natural talent for bringing people together, her calm demeanor and genuine kindness putting everyone at ease. A young woman approached Marcus hesitantly, clutching the hand of a little boy who couldn't have been more than 5. "Mr. Howard?" she asked softly. I just wanted to say thank you. If it weren't for this place, I don't know where we'd be." Marcus crouched down to the boy's level, offering him a high five. "You're very welcome," he said, his voice kind and steady. "But it's not just me. You've got a whole team here rooting for you. How are you settling in?" The woman's eyes welled with tears. "It feels like home," she whispered. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like we have a future." Marcus nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. "You do, and we'll be here to support you every step of the way." The impact of the Howard Harrison Foundation extended far beyond the city. Stories of its work spread across the country, inspiring others to join the movement. New centers were established in cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and Miami, each one tailored to meet the unique needs of its community. Marcus and Emily became prominent figures in the fight against homelessness and inequality. They were frequently invited to speak at conferences, schools, and fundraisers, sharing their story to raise awareness and inspire action. At one such event, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium, the audience hanging on his every word. "I spent years believing I was invisible, that no one cared whether I lived or died," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But one act of kindness changed everything. It reminded me that I mattered, that I wasn't alone. That's what we're trying to do with this foundation, show people that they matter." The audience erupted into applause, their faces reflecting the profound impact of his words. Robert, now deeply involved in the foundation, had found a renewed sense of purpose. He worked tirelessly to secure funding and partnerships, his regret for his past inaction driving him to make a difference. He often said that his work with the foundation was his way of honoring the memory of Jonathan Howard and making amends to Marcus and Emily. Emily, meanwhile, had become a fierce advocate for systemic change. She worked with policymakers and nonprofit organizations to address the root causes of homelessness and poverty, using her platform to amplify the voices of those who had long been ignored. One afternoon, as she and Marcus walked through the community center, she shared a new idea. "What if we started a mentorship program?" she suggested. "Pair people who've turned their lives around with those who are just starting their journey. It could make such a difference." Marcus's face lit up. "That's brilliant. Let's make it happen." On the 1-year anniversary of the foundation's launch, the Howard Harrison Community Center hosted a special event to celebrate its achievements. The center was decorated with strings of lights and colorful banners, and the air buzzed with excitement as families, volunteers, and community members gathered to reflect on the year's successes. Marcus took the stage, his heart swelling with gratitude as he looked out at the crowd. "This foundation started with a simple act of kindness," he began. "One sandwich, shared on a cold day, set everything in motion. That moment reminded me of the power we all have to make a difference, no matter how small." He paused, his gaze landing on Emily, who smiled at him from the front row. "This isn't just my story," he continued. "It's our story. It's about the people who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. It's about the volunteers who show up every day, the donors who make this work possible, and the people we serve who inspire us with their strength and resilience." The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the room. Emily joined him on stage, taking his hand as they stood together, a united front in their mission to create a better world. As the years passed, the Howard Harrison Foundation continued to thrive, its reach expanding to communities across the globe. Marcus and Emily never lost sight of their mission, dedicating themselves fully to the work they believed in. Their story became a powerful reminder of the impact one person can have when they choose kindness. Through their foundation, they proved that even the darkest past could be transformed into a source of light and hope. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus and Emily sat on the porch of their home, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. The laughter of children from a nearby playground drifted through the air, a comforting reminder of the lives they had touched. Marcus turned to Emily, his expression soft. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "All the time. And I think about how it all started. With a simple sandwich." He chuckled, wrapping an arm around her. "That sandwich changed everything." Emily tilted her head to look at him. "No, Marcus. You changed everything. Your strength, your compassion. You've inspired so many people." Marcus pressed a kiss to her forehead, his heart full. "We did this together, and we're just getting started." As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Marcus and Emily sat in peaceful silence, their hearts filled with gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. They knew there were still challenges to face and lives to change, but they were ready, because they had learned that even the smallest act of kindness could spark a movement. And with love, compassion, and determination, they would continue to make the world a better place, one act of kindness at a time. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us for more stories of bravery, inspiration, and the human spirit.